Mr. Chair and members of the Budget Committee, appreciate the opportunity to stand before you today. I'm actually losing track at how many times I've had to do this now, so that's probably, hopefully, a good thing. We did meet last week, and I delivered a budget message to you, which is in writing. It's been posted to the Jackson County website if any citizens are interested in taking a look at that. This actually contains portions of what was included in the budget message, but also is kind of meant to set the parameters in a broader overview for the budget. And you'll hear from each of the departments over today and next week, or this week on Thursday, as well as take input from the public regarding the budget. So I timed this at about 30 minutes. It could run a little bit long depending on whether we have technical difficulties or not. So let me go ahead and get started here. What I wanted to lay out first for you is impacts to county services. There's been bleeps of articles and television newscasts about what's been going on around us in counties. If you've noticed, Jackson County's kind of kept a low profile with regard to the kind of stories you've seen in the paper, which is probably a good thing as well. But to let you know what's going on around us, I kind of wanted to just provide a little bit of information. These are taken from news stories and headlines. This is a little short video that was done by OPB actually on Curry County. It'll probably take about 5 minutes here, but I thought it'd be good to frame the discussion. So.
Just about 20,000 live on the Pacific Coast in Curry County, the southwestern corner of Oregon. In the 80s, this county received millions of dollars each year from logging payments from the Federal Secure Schools program. The county's getting afloat since then. That program has expired, and the county is projecting a $3 million shortfall every year. Commissioner David Itzen says Curry County may go bankrupt by July.
The sudden lack of revenue is so great in its impact on our budget that we could cut everything and it simply wouldn't be enough.
6 years ago, Curry County had $290 to spend per person in a general fund. That fund pays for things like public health, elections. Today, instead of $290 per person, Curry County has about $110.
The question for us is not just what we cut, but what programs, what services our citizens will no longer receive.
Patricia Savage is a nurse for the Curry County Public Health Department. One of her jobs is overseeing this health clinic in the Brookings Harbor High School.
Some kids have no insurance and they aren't going to go anywhere else. They can't afford it. For the parents who are working or don't have transportation, we can see their kids right here. They don't have to take off work. And that has been a real advantageous thing for a lot of families.
In addition to running the clinics, the 3 county nurses go on home visits and track diseases like tuberculosis. The department mostly funds itself, but the county has provided it with the basics: the building, keeping up the payroll. Starting in July, Curry County can no longer afford to do even that.
I think there was a time when there was more hopefulness that timber sales would be restored or the ONC funding would come back somehow. And I think that that hope has pretty much dwindled as those resources have dried up. It's pretty unsettling not knowing what's going to be happening less than 6 months from now.
So go ahead and key up your point again. Send me that.
The cities, Brookings, Gold Beach, have their own police, but county deputies are responsible for all the places in between. Undersheriff Bob Rector is coordinating a search for 3 missing mushroom pickers. Rector is one of just 5 county patrolmen on duty, but the police force may get even smaller.
My operations budget is at bare bones, so the only place I have to cut now is employees. Of course, unfortunately, I don't even have many employees to cut.
Bishop says he's not sure how the county will function if it lays off more staff. It's not clear who will issue birth certificates. And when a person dies, who will certify the death and release their body to a morgue?
My wife and I, we chose to raise our family here, and we love it here and are vested here. But if we don't have the public safety or the infrastructure to get birth certificates or death certificates or whatever, why would you want to live here?
Raising taxes is an obvious solution. It's hard to do in Curry County. The Rogue River National Forest takes up about 2/3 of the land, and federal land can't be taxed. On top of that, there are private forests and farms, which are taxed at a low rate. Only 4% of the land is fully taxable.
I think if the federal government would get out of our way and let the counties manage at least part of the lands, I think it would help.
There's another reason the county is on the verge of bankruptcy. The 4% of the land that is taxable doesn't get taxed much. Curry County's property tax rates are effectively the lowest in the state.
I think some kind of a tax increase is going to be necessary.
The county has placed tax increases on the ballot several times before, and they've all been defeated.
You take all the politics and everything away, it comes down to funding. And how much funding do we want to pay for how much service? I don't think it gets any simpler than that. It's up to the citizens to decide what they want.
So I know that that was a little bit long, but I think it kind of framed probably the worst case scenario in our state, which we are not the worst case scenario. But a lot of the points that you heard in that video are points that have been shared here in our county among elected officials and constituency as well. There are counties, though, that are in our similar position that are having much more severe impacts than we're having based on how we prepared ourselves as compared to how they probably didn't prepare themselves. This is Lane County, and these are taken right from news articles. Now, obviously, everything that I report to you here can change slightly because every county's going through their budget process like we are, so these aren't hard numbers. But if you look at in Lane County, they're looking at dropping 80 positions. Now, this is just from their sheriff's office, and I've kind of focused on public safety since in our county, that's our top priority. Typically, probably in most local governments, public safety is going to be right up there, if not the top priority. So they're looking at cutting 80 positions from their sheriff's department, 24 sworn. That means for all of Lane County, which you understand is about twice the population of Jackson County, they're going to have 6 deputies, 2 sergeants, and a lieutenant for the whole police force. Their jail capacity is being reduced by 131 beds. Of those remainder beds in their county, they happen to lease out about 100 of them. So they got about 120 beds to serve a population that's twice the size of our county. And in our county, with our local jail, which is 230 beds, and our transition center, which is 170 beds, we got about 400 beds to serve half of their population. So they anticipate a large number of layoffs throughout the county government there in Lane County, although they haven't identified all of those. One of the interesting points, because I know that we've struggled with this here locally, is, and I put this up here, I could probably pick any department in Lane County and they would be sending the same message, but is the assessor's office is likely to lose their state grant funds that help support assessment and taxation, and in their case, they're looking at probably not being able to accurately create a tax roll and actually collect taxes for the taxing districts they serve. That's likely to happen in several other counties who can't meet the requirements for staffing levels to be able to receive grant funds. And so the state is going to have a huge issue on their hands. And what happens when the state has to step in is the state will step in, but the county general fund becomes responsible for paying the cost of the state stepping in. So it's kind of a no-win situation. It'll get done, but it kind of puts the counties at further jeopardy. Klamath County, once again, one of our neighbor counties, pretty drastic drops in funds to their sheriff, district attorney, juvenile, and health departments. They expect pretty significant layoffs. The sheriff there stated basically that if those cuts happen, they'll eliminate all patrols in their county. Now, the Oregon legislature recently passed a bill that will allow counties, a handful of counties, to use road fund reserves to help fund in the short term rural patrols. Some of the counties don't have road fund reserves, and that passing of that bill isn't going to make a difference to them. And those that do, it's a short-term temporary fix, and it comes at the expense of not being able to maintain roads because they're taking money that was meant to maintain roads and using it for public safety. Josephine County, probably the closest to us. I know there was an article in the paper this morning, but they're looking at 60% cuts in their public safety. Sheriff's Office, District Attorney, Juvenile. They've released 30 of 150 inmates that they have now, and they plan to basically reduced down to 30 beds. The article in the paper today said that they're going to basically have 5 beds that will serve the police agencies in their city, because the rest are either rented out or they're used for Measure 11 holds. So 58 total layoffs. That number's kind of bounced around Josephine County, and it'll probably continue to bounce around until they actually adopt a budget. So after all of that good news, let me kind of jump into how much bigger the problem is than timber revenue. A lot of what I just painted, and even in the Curry County video you heard the loss of timber revenue, but I think it's, and I've spoken about this a couple of times, but I want to actually put some numbers on paper and show you what I'm talking about. It's a bigger problem than timber revenue, and especially in our county. So for timber revenue, or O&C revenue, or Public Law 106, any one of the versions that we've received, at one point, it used to fund a huge portion of our general fund. If you go back 20, 30 years, I just went back 5 years ago. So this could look more drastic, but I wanted to put it in the context of how we're managing money today. But we lost about $15.6 million in general fund. That's money that we get to decide where it gets spent. We call it non-dedicated operating revenue. We lost $3.4 million in Title II and Title III. I'm going to include this for purposes of the argument as discretionary spending, even though it's dedicated specifically to activities on federal lands. The reason why I'm doing that is because the activities that we use those for in our county are related to public safety, and if we're not using those funds for doing those public safety activities, the burden falls back to the general fund if we continue to do them. And then we lost $4 million in road fund, and I asterisk that because I'm not going to include that in the ending total, because that's dedicated to the road. I'm really focused on what the budget committee has discretion over spending when I'm making this argument to you. Interest earnings, and let me qualify this. I'll probably qualify this on every slide because these numbers are approximates. They're rounded. The decimals, I didn't carry them all the way out, so they're not going to be exact. They're going to be close. But if we roughly have a $170 million portfolio that we're investing in, the peak, our rate was about 5.2% we were earning on that. We're down to 1.4% now. We lost 3.8%. So we were earning about $8.85 million from that. We're down to $2.38 million. Down $6.47 million. That used to be split roughly 50% to the general fund and 50% back out to dedicated funds. So, you know, we lost $3.23 million there. That may not seem like a lot, but that's probably 75% of the district attorney's budget, if you want to put it in perspective. I know the district attorney's here, so. Property tax base growth, you know, we were averaging 5.3% growth 5 years ago. We're down to 1% actually this year in the budget. We budgeted for a 0% increase in gross, but down 4.3% or points. Averaging about approximately $32.78 million in tax-based revenue. So we lost another $1.41 million that we used to be able to normally depend on. You add that to the loss of interest income, and I think that's about 100% of the DA's budget. Put it in perspective. I'll pick another budget next time, Mark. We've had all sorts of changes in state law and state funding that have affected our budget. These changes are specific to things that affected our general fund. You know, we've lost millions of dollars throughout dedicated funds and funding from the state, but these are, once again, back just to the general fund where you have discretion. So the County Assessment Function Funding Assistance Grant, the CAFA grant, this is the part that goes to fund part of our tax assessment department. It used to cover about 32% of the budget. Now we're down to about 17% or down 15%. That's $690,000 a year that we had to come up with to fund those activities so that all the taxing districts could continue to receive their funding. That's a lot of money that the state used to cover that now our general fund's burdened with. House Bill 2714 large impact to our justice court. We're projecting at around a $650,000 reduction. Revenues that are earned in the justice court go into the general fund. They fund the traffic safety team generally, and then they fund any other general expense that's discretionary that you would choose to fund. So, there's another $650,000 that we lost to state changes. The state made a lot of changes that hurt counties. You would probably hear an argument from them that it didn't, that it was meant to be revenue neutral, but bottom line is the budget numbers don't lie. I mean, when you you can call something revenue neutral, but when you lose $650,000 in general fund revenue, that's not quite neutral. Economy has had a significant impact on our budget over the last several years. 5 years ago, roughly, we used to budget our revenue from the clerk's office. This was from all of the recording of documents and mortgages and lending activities that were going on when the housing boom was going on. So we lost $750,000 a year in revenue there. And then community development fees. The general fund currently supports community development to the tune of $1.2 million approximately in this budget. That's a department that at one point was just about self-supporting. So once again, another burden on the general fund. When you add all of these things up, this is what's kind of shocking to me, and I don't know the public generally, because they don't get all this information normally consolidated in one area, understands really the difficulty that we've had to deal with to kind of maintain the level of service that we've been able to deliver in our county, but almost down $27 million in revenue a year. So it's a lot more significant than just O&C. And I would say, I think I put up there our property tax base is about $32 million. That's obviously the biggest contributor to our general fund. It's almost a doubling of the service level if you look at how much revenue we've lost. But I think the public would generally find it hard to see that they lost half of the services we were delivering. So what that means is we've got really creative in how we've delivered services. We've become more efficient. We've become less costly, and I'm going to show you how we've become less costly next. Really to show you how we've dealt with this loss of all of these revenues up to this point. Let me just take a breath here. Does anybody have any questions so far about where I'm at, or do you want to wait till we get to the end?
If you have any right now, we can ask them, or if not,
okay,
go ahead and continue.
So I want to talk about how we've dealt with these things over the last 5 years. People have talked about how the county's managed ourselves pretty well to get to the position we're at, but I think people lose perspective once something's behind us. And for us, it's very important that we keep perspective, especially because we're not all the way where we need to be yet. So this is probably not hugely simple to read, but this is a tracking of changes that we've made, and these can generally be reflected back to the budget. There's assumptions that are made here. If you look at the very top of the chart, we assume an average cost increase index of 7.27. That means if something cost $100 this year, next year it's going to cost $107.27 for the same service. And that's about the escalation in costs of county services. Now, we don't fund departments to that tune. We, for example, in this year's budget, increased budget targets 2%, which means departments had to make a 5% cut. And we've generally done that at least each of these 5 years, and if you just average it at 5% a year, that means over 5 years departments have cut 25%. Or they've developed other revenues, or they've become more efficient in how they deliver the service. Some of these are because of proactive actions on behalf of the board and budget committee. Some of these are circumstantial, which ultimately ended up being in our benefit financially. But if you look at the libraries, obviously, back in 07, 08, when we closed the libraries, we had a full year of cost reductions, and that's why the cost reductions are less as you move forward, because we opened back up. But that's about a $23 million savings over the 5 years that we were able to create from what we did with the libraries. Community justice, we were actually able to back out $1 million a year back in 07 of general fund support. Now, in this budget that you have before you, we put $1 million back into their budget, so those numbers would change going forward, but up to that point, it's about $5.7 million. The historical societies was a result of actually the county, this was one of those circumstantial issues, the county having met all of our obligations under the lawsuit and settlement agreement. with the historical societies. Up to 07, 08, we had paid a little over $2.3 million to the Southern Oregon Historical Society, who then distributed funds from there to some of the smaller 12 or 13 historical societies around the county. But that fact that we met our obligation there relieved that burden on the general fund. A lot of people didn't know in 07, 08, when we had to close the libraries, there was a lot of focus on just that, but we had to cut a lot more than just that, and that year we cut $3 million from the sheriff's budget. And that carries forward for a total savings of $17 million over the 5 years. Now, as I just said, in community justice, we had to increase their budget $1 million. In this year's budget in the sheriff's, we actually decreased their budget target $2 million. So that number will get bigger, and once again, another cut to the sheriff's office or public safety over that period of time. The general fund, in addition to supporting maintenance at the Fair and Expo, used to provide a general fund support to the Fair and Expo. Back in 07, 08, it was $177,000 a year, and that's adjusted for the future value at 7.27%. But over 5 years, that cut out about $1 million. Parks also was funded at $200,000 a year from the general fund. We broke that up over a period of years, reduced their funding down to now they receive nothing from the general fund, but it started at $100,000, and you can see in 9-10 it went to $200,000 plus the escalation. And then PERS, this is probably kind of unique for our county. There's a couple of things that happened here. When I started in the end of 06, 07, the county was creating a PERS reserve for past actuarial liabilities. So liabilities that we were going to owe money from things that happened in the past. We were collecting 5.84% of payroll. This is one where I actually kind of challenged our auditors. They went and met with PERS, and PERS actually agreed with me that we did not need to continue to collect for that past liability because lawsuits had been settled. And so any liability we would incur would be a future liability, and we pay as we go in PERS. You'll see, so we stopped collecting that amount, which had the $675,000 effect on the general fund. What we did after that also is unique, and it puts Jackson County actually in a better situation with regard to PERS than most counties, is we took the reserve we had, a portion of the reserve we had built, $9 million, and we went and set up what's called a side account with PERS. And what a side account does is it buys down our future rates. So in Jackson County, or for local municipalities around us, when they get assessed rates, our rates are between 1.5% to 2% lower than everyone else's rates because we set up the side account. We set up the side account for $9 million. It will save us $20 million over the 20 years. And so, and this is just 5 years into it. So you see here about $60 million in cost reductions, savings, whatever you want to call it. And once again, let me qualify, this is based on some assumptions, and someone could argue that it's not exact, but they are numbers that can tie back to the budget. Over that period of time, this is something I know the Budget Committee pays. I'm sorry?
Danny, I had a question. I know you've done a lot more savings than those, for instance, in the self-insurance program. Is there a reason you didn't add, are these just the major savings? Because I know there's a lot of other areas where you made savings.
Yeah, there's probably about, I would guess, $75 million in cost savings, and I'm going to talk about a few of those in the future. These were the major ones that I've been tracking for 5 years. Sometimes a lot of the public will ask, well, what did you really do? And so, you know, it's hard to track every single little thing. And, you know, I'll cover some of those other things we did, but I wanted to put the big numbers up, and then we can focus on some of those other things as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
So this is something that I know the Budget Committee pays a lot of attention to. Generally, what happens is we budget an FTE and then we run short of those because we're constantly filling vacancies. This is across the county, but if you look, we've had about a 20% reduction in FTE from 06, 07 through today, 208 FTE for actual. So we went from 1,074 to 866 employees. A lot of people say, well, you know, you need to cut at the county, you're not making reductions, and you have too many employees and you're doing too much. Bottom line is we made pretty significant cuts not as significant as some of those counties around us will have to make that I pointed out to you in the beginning. But we're looking for that sustainable level of service. Now, one thing I want to say about that number, because a lot of people say we did it at the expense of putting people into unemployment, is a huge portion of those FTE, full-time equivalent, actually went to work for other companies. So the library had 106 FTE. When we outsourced the library, a large portion of those employees went to work for LSSI. We ran a methadone program. We ran the jail medical program. All of those employees went to work for those private companies. So it was a transfer, which makes it less expensive for the county, but doesn't necessarily unemploy people. And then another good portion of those people or those positions were removed through attrition. They weren't actual layoffs. We have had some layoffs, but what I'm telling you is that number doesn't accurately represent the number of people that may have lost a job, as opposed to a change in how we deliver service or taking advantage of the fact that we have positions come open and we can reduce them through attrition. So here's a few other changes. I didn't put the numbers to all of these. Manager self-insurance is one. Over the last, since 08, we've saved about $1.2 million by moving the managers and confidential employees into a self-insurance plan rather than a full insurance plan. It is something that I have approached our biggest union about, and when I get to what our problem still is, I want to talk to you about that again, because it's not something I've given up on. We did move our employment law in-house. We used to contract with a firm whose top rate was about $500 an hour, all the way down to $250 an hour. We do it in-house for $100 an hour, and we've been much more effective in reducing costs. This is something that we have to compare what we do between HR and our law office over the series of years and make some deductive reasoning in what those cost savings are. And since we just started doing it last year, we do have a cost savings. Wasn't significant enough in just 1 year for me to put a number up there. One thing that I think has been hugely helpful, and it's really hard to put a number to, is we, in our workers' comp program, entered into a contractual agreement with someone that basically serves as an owner's rep. So when someone has a workers' comp claim, someone represents the county that actually can go to the doctor's appointments, talk with the doctor, help develop a plan to move an employee out of workers' comp. We were able to clean up a whole lot of workers' comp claims that way. Hard to put a number to what those claims cost, or to actually say that they wouldn't have ended anyways. I mean, it's the truth is a lot did end and come off of our workers' comp books, but there's a lot more things like this that we do internally administratively that aren't great big things that help reduce the deficit spending that we're having, and I'll get into a couple of those as I move forward. One thing that I wanted to say is, while all this has happened, Jackson County, I think, probably for any municipality in our county, has been the only government agency that I'm aware of that has been able to reduce taxes as a taxing entity. So there's, and Josh is here, Josh Gibson, there's 37 taxing districts. Is that correct, Josh? 36. Okay. 36 taxing districts. We're one of those. And for us, we've been able to reduce taxes. A couple of things that we were able to do that was we sunset our urban renewal agency in White City. Now, that would have came at some time anyways. We just hit the cap earlier than was projected, which means we were able to reduce taxes sooner than we would have normally expected, which was good. That was about to our citizens countywide. And then we made our final payment on our juvenile bonds. We actually did that early. We paid our juvenile bonds off in advance. We did that through making payments to buy down the balance as we sold properties or acquired one-time funds. And this was about a $3 million countywide tax reduction. So $7.5 million a year in reduced taxes to our citizens, while we also made the reductions to savings we did in our budget. Talk a little bit about capital projects. This gets a lot of attention every year because people often wonder why we're struggling to deliver services we would be completing capital projects. Let me frame this first of all. Service delivery is based on what we call operating revenue. That's constant and predictable revenue that the county gets. We can depend on. We know that we're going to be able to use it for operations, and that's the kind of money that we spend. Projects are done using non-operating revenue, which means it's one-time money. We're going to get it one time. If we put it into staff, we're going to turn around and lay off staff. So we use it for things that are one-time events, and capital projects are one-time events. One thing that's nice about doing capital projects right now is the cost is reduced significantly. We're probably talking about 40 to 50% cost reductions in doing the same projects that 5 years ago would have cost 40 or 50% more. These projects that I'm going to talk about are just specific to projects that were funded from the general fund. The county does all sorts of capital projects outside of the general fund, like build an airport terminal or build roads and those kinds of things. But these are ones that just came from non-operating revenue that is discretionary general fund. Now this is going to be a little hard to follow because there's 2 sheets and it goes back by year. So I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly, but if you look on all of the major projects, and we've done also some minor projects. These are just all ones that we would inventory as capital. All the way through down to the bottom right, you can see here $22 million since 2007 that we've done in capital projects tied to the general fund. Now, some of those projects also had other funding sources that help support the project, but this is just the portion of general fund that supported the project. That's $22 million in capital infrastructure needs that the county was able to complete without going to the voters and asking them to pass new taxes to help us complete them. Some of those are major projects, like the new 911 center out at the airport that allowed consolidation of 911 and dispatch services for all agencies in the county. That reduced operating costs, which reduced costs to the taxpayers. Some of them have, been obviously more contentious than others. There's a lot of discussion about this facility out in White City, and we're still obviously in the process of completing that project. That'll be done here, hopefully the end of this month and early next month. If you, depending on who you talk to, of course, if you talk to the contractors who have bid and been able to be awarded these contracts, this kept a lot of people working during the slowdown of the economy in our county, and it also helped the county meet our capital needs at a reduced cost as compared to what it was 5 years ago. So now we get to where we are now, and I went through all of that because we often receive accolades for doing such a good job in our county of managing money, because we're not having the drastic reductions that counties are having around us, and I've kind of explained what we've done to avoid that, but we're not all the way where we need to be yet, and that's kind of where I've built up to this point. I went over these a little bit. For purposes of people understanding how our budget works, I'm going to go over them real quickly. So I talked about operating revenue, constant and predictable. We know it comes in at a certain time. Our property tax base is an example of that. Non-operating revenue, this is the part we would use for capital projects or one-time events. This is fund balances, reserves, windfalls. It's money we can't depend on into the future. Dedicated revenues, frankly, most of our budget is dedicated revenue. It comes for a specific purpose, and we have to use it for that purpose. So a lot of people say, well, you've got $4 million in your fund balance out at the airport. Why don't you use that to open more hours at the library? And because it's dedicated revenue, it has to be used at the airport. It would be illegal for us to take that money and use it at the library. I've heard it said that, why are you building a new health and human services facility? You should be taking that money and opening more hours at the library. Fact is, that would be illegal to do, because the money we're using to remodel a health and human services facility is dedicated funding from the health and human services budget that has to be used for that purpose. Non-dedicated, that's where we get to decide, you as the budget committee get to decide, like non-dedicated operating revenue the best. That's our favorite kind of money, because we can use it for services and we get to decide what's most important in terms of service delivery. So this is how our revenues come to us right now. I said that we like non-dedicated operating revenue the best, and you can see that's the least percentage of revenue type that we have. So if you really think about it, when you're looking at this, that 11.59% of a $316 million budget is where you get to make the decisions the money gets spent. The 37.98 is dedicated. You don't really get to decide. The state or the federal government sends it to us and they say this is what you will spend it on. Dedicated non-operating revenue, that's fund balances in those dedicated funds. Once again, really has to be spent within that fund's purpose. And then non-dedicated, non-operating revenue, that's kind of our rainy day fund, one-time money where you have discretion. When you look at our budget and you look at just the operating side, not the non-operating, $56 million operating budget. Last year we had about $165 million operating budget, so our operating budget has reduced by $10 million. A huge portion of that is state funding, dedicated state funding. Health and Human Services, to be real specific. Part of that is because of how we account for funds that come to us. We used to receive funding from the state in the millions of dollars that we pass through. We no longer receive it and pass it through. The state is going to contract directly for those services. So it doesn't necessarily mean a service reduction. It just means that the money is being spent through different channels. This is how this budget recommends, and generally how in the past we've spent that non-dedicated operating revenue. A couple things have changed in this one. First of all, I'll draw your attention to the bottom chart there where it says reserve funds. That means we're spending 6.2, almost 6.3 million more dollars than we have received in operating revenue. That's coming from our rainy day fund. So every year for the last 5 years, we've spent somewhere between $5 and $6 million in reserve funds. So we've been criticized a lot. Well, why don't you just spend some of that operating reserve or rainy day fund that you have? And the truth is we are spending it, and we have been spending it. It's been a purposeful choice on behalf of the Budget Committee to spend it to maintain the services that we have. The biggest portion of our budget, our revenues, operating revenues, go to public safety. That is the Budget Committee's #1 priority. It's about 69.5%. It's actually dropped from last year. It used to be a larger percentage. And that doesn't just mean the sheriff, community justice, and the district attorney. It doesn't include the justice court because the justice court brings a revenue to the general fund, not an expense. 4.52% for internal services, which is a really good number if you understand how overhead charges work. This is just within the general fund, so this isn't to the dedicated funds. This is just the portion of general fund that's responsible for indirect costs. There's a combination of things like our community development department, our assessment department. The libraries at 9.95%, slightly above all the others combined, is our second largest consumer of our operating revenue. And actually that 9.95% last year would have been higher. It's not because we reduced funding to the libraries, because the state changed the law on how we have to account for economic development funds that come to the county. We actually they used to come to the general fund and go right to the library. Now they come to from that fund to the library. So the libraries actually receive more of a percentage than what is represented on here, but it's represented this way because of the change in how we have to report. And then Health and Human Services, 6.18%. And that 6.18% really probably could go to public safety for the most part, because the biggest portion of that funding is to run the jail medical program, which they manage the contract for. And then a small portion goes to service partners who contract to provide safety net services through our Health and Human Service Department for clients in our county. So this is almost the same exact slide with a little different number from last year, and I got to make sure that I qualify this each year. Our operating expenditures exceed our operating revenues by almost $6.3 million. We operate at a deficit. Purposeful, much thoroughly discussed with the Budget Committee. Additional services, it's not sustainable in terms of operating revenue to operating expenditures, and in fact, over the next 3 to 4 years, we have to close that $6 million gap some way, or we're going to be making more drastic cuts like those counties around us. Probably still not as drastic, but more significant than we're seeing in this year's budget. One thing that everybody likes to hear about is how much money do we have in the bank. So Last year when I did this chart, we had about $99 million between general fund reserves and ending fund balances. This year we have about, well, let me just do the general fund here first, about $32 million in general fund reserves. The rainy day fund, that's set aside in what's called an unappropriated ending fund balance. That's why we call it rainy day. We technically can't spend it unless there's an emergency. General fund reserves, this is for cash flow. So a lot of jurisdictions go out and borrow money short term to run their operations for the first 3 or 4 months because they don't have money in the bank to do it until the taxes come in. In our county, because we have money in the bank, so we set aside $10 million. That gets spent, but then it gets paid back. And then other general fund reserves at $2.2 million. So about $32 million in general fund reserves. Dedicated fund portions about $50 million. So between all of those dedicated funds, ending fund balances, which is different than reserves, but treated similarly within a department's budget, we have a total of $82 million. This is still, even though it's not $99 million like it was last year, and the biggest contributor to that is the fact that we're going to do the Health and Human Services facility, which bought down a good portion of their ending fund balance. This is still impressive on a $316 million budget to have $82 million in reserves and ending fund balances. And my guess is proportionately you wouldn't find any budget in our state for any jurisdiction that kind of situation. Maybe someone who's carrying a huge amount of road fund reserves, which obviously can just be used for roads. But other than that, pretty tough. At this amount of revenue, if all money stopped coming to the county, we could operate for about 6 months, which once again isn't likely to be something that any jurisdiction can do in our state, and probably mostly even across the country. So this budget that I presented to you in the budget message last week and that we'll hear today generally continues current service levels. In other words, we have no drastic huge cuts. Probably the most affected budget will be Health and Human Services, and when we get into their budget, you'll understand why that is. It does provide for the security of service delivery, $82 million in reserves or ending fund balances for all funds. This is $82 million, not just to support that $16 million budget, but $82 million to support $157 million operating budget. So, as I said before, we could operate. Operating revenues do still exceed, our expenditures exceed operating revenues by $6.2 million. I want to talk about that $6.2 million because when I did the budget message, Craig Morris brought up the fact that, so Danny, are you telling us in 3 years basically the sky's going to fall and we're not doing anything about it? But he said it in a much nicer way. I want to tell you some of the things that we're planning over the next 3 or 4 years or that we're working on to close that gap. And there's some pretty significant things that could happen for us that don't require us to go out and ask the taxpayers to pay more taxes. And there's a lot of moving parts to this, so none of this is guaranteed, but I at least want the public to understand some of the things we're working on. So one of the things we're working on is we're in the process of adding 62 jail beds. And we have an issue with jail bed space. Honestly, even though the paper reported it was an issue with more people being brought to jail and us having to release it, that is, state courts cut their pretrial release program and stopped releasing people that they used to release that now we have to release because they're not doing it anymore. We actually had the same number of bookings in the jail from first quarter of last year to first quarter of this year. That's why I'm saying that. But those 60 beds create the opportunity for us to have more jail space, but it also creates the opportunity for us to develop a revenue. And if we were able to lease out those beds, say, to federal agencies, U.S. Marshals, or immigration or federal parole, we could generate about roughly $3 million a year in revenue. Now, it costs us $1 million to run it, so it'd be a net gain of $2 million, but that drops that $6.2 million down to $4.2 million. I talked earlier about the managers being in a management self-insurance plan. We likely could drop the cost of insurance for our largest union about $1.5 million to $2 million a year if they would agree to move into a self-insurance plan. It doesn't reduce any benefit. They still get all of the same medical care and everything they have. It's just that we administer the plan rather than paying to do it. So if we can negotiate that with our union, we could drop another $2 million off of what I just told you now would be $4.2 million. We'd be down to $2.2 million. The state with community justice has cut our budget about $1.4 million a year for the last 2 years over what we expected. This is cyclical with the state. Since I worked with the state 15 years ago and went through many biennial budgets as a state-funded department, I'm aware that what happens as the state starts recovering, all of a sudden a whole bunch of money comes, and frankly in the past the state's probably been a little reckless overspending when they get large influxes of money. I know that they're on a route now to develop a reserve and those types of things, but at least funding the counties back at current service level could cut another $1.4 million out of that $2.2 million I just told you about. And so you see that we're closing the gap real quickly without having to go out and ask the taxpayers for money. There's a lot of other things that we're looking at doing as well as those. I just gave you a couple of highlights. But I want you to know we're not just sitting back, not thinking about how to do it. And I think we'll get there. And that assumes we don't have anything happen with the federal government with timber revenue or O&C reauthorization or a pickup in our economy. Now, if our economy continues on a downward spiral and the state and feds continue to cut us, that's going to make this situation worse. So that's why I told you there are a lot of moving parts, and we'll continue to do the best we can working with the departments and the board and budget committee to get there. Guess I went way past my time. But you told me to take it up, so.
I think it's very important that we have this overview and we understand it. Have you finished your comments then?
I have, yeah.
I'd entertain questions or comments from anybody on the budget committee.
Mr. Chair, Danny, you said that 6.2, somewhere between $5 and $6 million over the past 5 years we've been spending in the reserves. Is that correct? Did I misunderstand that? I mean, when the economy started going south, receiving some money from secure rural schools. So were we spending in the deficit at that rate?
Yeah, in 07, 08, we closed the libraries for part of a fiscal year. So in that year, we actually didn't deficit spend, but then we got a one-year reauthorization. And what I brought to the board and budget committee then was a plan to open the libraries for 2 to 3 years. That was 5 going on 6 years ago, so we're doing much better than I proposed to begin with. But going all the way back to then, that's how we funded the libraries out of reserves. If you look at what we're spending in reserves, $6.2 million, about $5 million of that is libraries and $1.2 million of that is development services. That's where the money's being spent. Now, in development services, we don't have to supplement that budget. The law actually allows us to charge that out in fees, but the board and budget committee have chosen not to place that burden at this point while we can afford to continue to subsidize it in increased fees to citizens. Instead, we've chosen to use general fund to support it. Condition, and we still had to do the service, that's an option, is that the users pay for the cost of doing it. The libraries have, in terms of budget committee policy in the past, and you're a new budget committee, so you can change your policy if you want, have been if we get to the point of not being able to fund it, they're at the bottom of the list. They're the first thing that gets closed because they're a discretionary program, not mandatory. Now, obviously, we want to avoid doing that, and we're going to do everything we can. But if you look at that $6.2 million, that's really what is causing us to deficit spend at this point.
Thanks.
Danny, did you, will the potential income from the federal funds through Biden's addition on the transportation bill, will that impact that number at all?
We did not budget for that, but let me explain that. Each year there is a cut of timber. And each year in the budgets, at least since I've been here and maybe even before, we budgeted to receive a portion of funding from the cuts. This budget actually has a small amount of funding from timber harvest. I think it's 1 million, 1.4 million. What has happened in the past is that we've budgeted that, and then when we get a reauthorization, we offset what we budgeted by what we get, so it balances. So there's $1.4 million in here for timber harvest. If we get a reauthorization, right, we can either accept the timber harvest or we can accept the reauthorization. We have the choice. The number that we're being shot is probably somewhere around $4 million. So that's not in this budget, but if we do receive it, that that $4 million will be reduced by the $1.4 million we budgeted from the harvest. So we're really talking about an increase of $2.6 million in revenue. we would still be operating at a deficit. It's been the Budget Committee's past practice, because we are operating at a deficit, to put that into reserves as one-time funding. So I think I'm glad you asked that question, that this reauthorization isn't the kind of reauthorization that actually funds county services to any significant level. In fact, it almost creates more harm, because people believe, since the federal government paid what they funded, that now we should be able to deliver all these services. And the fact is, going from $23 million a year in timber revenue to $2.6 million net for us doesn't do a whole lot in a $316 million budget. It's less than 1%.
Mr. Chair, I had a meeting with the Forest Service and BLM this morning, and that's why I was just a little late for the meeting, but they indicated, as well as Commissioner Hare, that they didn't think that reauthorization would occur. So that was the latest word. So
Yeah, they probably won't get the cut up either.
Oh, no, that was another point too, and I don't want to go into detail.
You could be short $1.4 million.
Yeah, we could be. Yeah, could be. Thank you.
Excuse me for my pessimism. Any other comments?
No.
And I've been through that whole period that you talked about, back 5 years, and quite a few people on the committee have. And I think I hope you have a handout that we would be able to have those facts to be able to refer to it.
I think you got a copy of the presentation. I'm not sure.
Did we?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get you a copy of the presentation.
No.
It would sure help if we had that.
Yeah. It'll be posted online as well too. If you ever want to refer someone to it, it'll be on our website. But we'll get you a hard copy as well, Mr. Chair.
Great. I think it's just a heck of a great story, and you ought to be proud of it. And I am, as a part of the Budget Committee.